In the last video, we looked at the cognitive interview, which is an alternative to the standard police interview that uses our understanding of how memory works to improve eyewitness recall. The next question is, how do we know that the cognitive interview actually does result in better eyewitness memory recall than traditional police interviews? Geiselman, Fisher and their team evaluated the original version of the cognitive interview by recruiting 17 highly experienced interviewers. This included police detectives, CIA investigators and private detectives. The researchers got 89 undergraduates to watch one of 4 films depicting a violent murder, borrowed from the Los Angeles Police Department Training Academy. 48 hours after watching the crime, the students were interviewed by the professional investigators. They were randomly assigned to either receive cognitive interviews or standard police interviews, as well as other options. These interviews were transcribed and scored. An exhaustive list of all of the details of the crimes that were mentioned was drawn up, and then researchers calculated the proportion of those items mentioned by each of the students. Doing this, they found that the cognitive interview elicited between 25 and 35% more information than the standard police interview. So that's very promising. But what if the improvements do not generalize to real crime situations? Well, Fisher and Geiselman went on to test the cognitive interview in more realistic situations. In one example, they recruited 16 police detectives based in Florida to see whether the cognitive interview improved eyewitness memory for real crime investigations. In the initial phase of the study, they recorded and analysed 5 to 7 interviews by each detective over 4 months. Then they randomly chose half the detectives and trained them in how to give the cognitive interview. Then they monitored and analysed interviews conducted by both the trained and untrained detectives for 7 months afterwards. They eventually amassed between 2 and 7 appropriate interviews per detective. All the interviews were transcribed and analysed as before. Of course, one big disadvantage of studying real crime investigations is that it is much harder to determine what is actually true or not for purposes of determining whether the interviews were yielding real or false memories. The way they did this in this particular study was by comparing what the witnesses said with another reliable source of information, such as another witness, a confession by the criminal, or from hidden camera footage. So they only looked at corroborated facts. This is what they found. So the cognitive interview in this real-world study looking at real crimes led to a 47% increase in the number of facts recalled compared with a standard police interview. There's since been a large body of research looking at these cognitive interview techniques. A meta-analysis of some of this work by Gunter Konken of the University of Kiel and his colleagues confirmed that over 42 studies, the cognitive interview reliably generates more correct details than the standard interview, and this effect was greater the more realistic that the context of the study was. The cognitive interview is now routinely taught to the police officers in Britain and is also widely used in the US, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, Singapore and Hong Kong. Of course, as we're taking a scientific approach in this course, we also need to acknowledge the limitations of the cognitive interview. Like everything else in life, it's not perfect. The cognitive interview is more difficult to conduct than the standard interview, takes longer, and requires more effort on the part of the interviewer. Also, it's only useful for cooperative eyewitnesses. It's also very much about improving recall memory, but doesn't help with recognition memory, for instance, recognizing a suspect in a lineup. Finally, cognitive interviews tend to sound less natural and less like a normal conversation than a standard interview, which, if viewed on video during a trial, could potentially undermine how authentic jurors found the testimony to be. However, taking all that on board, it's still considered a valuable tool for the investigator, and it's a great example of how cognitive psychology research can be successfully applied to the real world.